Okay. Okay. All right. Welcome back. Second week of the new year. And it's funny because well, everything's actually kind of funny to me, which is kind of funny in itself, but that's a joke. I thought to myself, like, sometimes the topics get kind of redundant. When you say, like, we keep talking about the same thing over and over and over again. And I'm always curious as, like, why is that the case, that the topics are being repetitive? And then I came across this story with regards to the Buddha, right? And I thought, hey, it's an interesting story to tell you guys because it makes a lot of sense. This guy, back in the Buddha day, like 2,500, 600 years ago now, he was obviously like trying to educate everybody about Buddhism, but then there were a lot of people back then there were other religions back then and they were interested in like other topics, right? Like things about like the origins of the universe or how did we come to be? Because if you think about like most religions, the idea is like God created earth, God created man, etc., right? And they're asking like the Buddha, like, okay, who created the universe type of deal, like those types of questions. And so the Buddha replies, well, first off, he picks up a whole bunch of leaves, right? He has it in his hands. And then he asks the guy, are there more leaves in my hands or are there more leaves in the forest? And the guy was like, well, obviously the forest, right? And then the Buddha replies, the leaves in my hand represent all the knowledge that you need to lead you out of suffering, right? And that's the end of the story. What's that supposed to even mean? The leaves are basically all the topics that lead to like liberation, right? That leads to like you finding joy, you finding well-being, you finding the pathway out of suffering. There's a million questions that you can ask, there's a million topics that you can pursue. But if they don't really represent like and though that million types of topics represent like the leaves in the forest, right? There's so many random things that you can be asking or learning about. However, if they don't actually lead to liberation, like what's the point of studying, right? So that's why it seems like, well, the point is like certain questions are kind of extra that you don't need to answer, but then it's also, the other thing is like, if you are studying Buddhism, it's a very concentrated topic, right? So that's the first idea. Here's the second idea, which I've been thinking about, and then I read something that kind of reframes it. Like every time I say like life is suffering, I don't know whether like rubs you a certain way or like you understand like that's like the first noble truth of Buddhism is that all of life is suffering, right? But the word itself, dukkha, I'm not sure if I'm even pronouncing it right. It's said that like the English language doesn't really capture what that word actually truly means, right? But so it's not just suffering, it's just more like the constant level of being like unsatisfied, right? And so it's the framing is like very negative to some extent, and to what extent does it resonate with you that life is suffering? Because if you think about it, like you guys in this very moment, are you suffering? No, not really. You're in like a nice warm place. You're not being threatened by anybody. You're like well fed, you're clean, etc., right? So how can you really register like that life is suffering when in this present moment you're not actually suffering? But the idea it's more of like a global or like macro, like all of life is suffering, right? If you like, there are times, there's moments of joy, moments of non-suffering, and then moments where it's just like now, where it's just like quiet, etc. There is no suffering. But the idea is that on the macro level, ever since birth until death, if you had to summarize that story, it would be a story of suffering, right? And so I like what I was reading, which is that like we don't have to, like, if it doesn't resonate with you, this idea that life is suffering, you can almost like reframe the story and say that there's a path to well-being, okay? And you have a choice to walk down this path of well-being, okay? And where does this path lead you to? It leads you to tranquility, it leads you to like the end of suffering, to a certain level of happiness, to joy, right? And so here's the basic premise, right? Like, if you have a toothache, right? Like, let's just say you were in suffering right now and you have a toothache. What would you do? You would naturally go to seek a remedy, like go to the dentist, like get it addressed, and remove that pain, remove that toothache, right? And I guess this is like the difficulty of Buddhism and the difficulty of like articulating the idea of Buddhism, the idea of like life is suffering to you guys, to young kids. What if you're suffering from a disease? Okay, so if you have the toothache, the pain is so present, right? It's so clear, and you say, okay, I have to seek a remedy. But the question is, what if you are suffering from a disease and you have no idea that you're suffering from it to begin with, right? And that's, would you seek out the solution? And I guess that's the connection that I was thinking about. Like if you have a disease, and that's the diagnosis that like the Buddha gave, right? With his Four Noble Truths. Like, the disease is suffering. There's a way for you to stop it. There's a path for you to follow. It's the it's the Eightfold Path, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And the question is, it's up to you to seek the path, right? That's it. Okay. So, it's weird how I made this connection. When I say it's up to you to seek the path, remember from my lecture from last week, right? I told you guys, like, what was it the last thing that the Buddha said, right? He said, hey, everything is, he says, everything is, all conditioned things are basically an illusion, right? Like, you have to be diligent to work towards your own path of like liberation and salvation. Let me step back very quickly because like I'm referring to the notes, but then I'm not really connecting this idea. If you guys are here, right, and you guys are present and learning and developing, you are walking down this path towards well-being, okay? And you don't, and to some extent, you don't know that you are suffering. And I'll give you an example. And this is why I wrote down this example, okay? The example is a co-worker of mine, okay? She's a young lady, right? She does everything that like millennials do, right? So she like gets her nails done, she rides in Ubers a lot, and she likes to buy a lot of things, right? And that's typical, that's what the normal average adult does, okay? And so, you know, like I've had like numerous conversations with her, like, and it's funny because like she likes to buy things, right? And at some point, you know, the idea of like accumulating material things, like to some of us brings us a lot of joy. And you think about Christmas, right? Think about Christmas where it's like, oh, the joy in like getting and receiving gifts and stuff like that. A lot of the times people think like, oh, if I keep buying this and that, it's going to like bring me so much joy. But nobody, like it's very difficult for us to see the other side, which is that to some extent, accumulating these things actually bring us a lot of suffering as well. Why is that the case? Well, because we get attached to things, right? We get attached to all the like material things that we have. And if you recognize, ultimately, like the more that you listen, the more that you realize, if you begin to recognize that all material things are temporary anyway, you begin to realize that they don't actually bring you the same amount of joy that they once did, okay? And then you get to develop a little bit more wisdom. Little by little, you develop a little bit more wisdom, and then you begin to say, wait a minute, I don't need these things anymore. And you become less and less attached. And when you become less and less attached, what happens? You suffer a little bit less, right? And I think like this, one of the sources of suffering comes from attachment. Well, it's not what I think, it's what the Buddha says, right? And so, I find it fascinating that in observing my coworker, like she, in the sense that like this year, her New Year's resolution that she was telling me is, or she like wrote down one word to remind her about her New Year's resolution, and she wrote down the word temporary. And I asked her like, why'd you write down that word? And she said, well, I realized I gotta stop spending money on buying all these things that I don't need. And it's really, really fascinating. And I think, like you can see to some extent that she's like developing a little bit in terms of wisdom, that's A. And then B, she's like walking down a path towards well-being, right? And I also had like a side story of like how the other day I went to like this basketball game, right? And I took my headphones, right? And you know, they're those like big headphones, like not like Bluetooth headphones, etc., right? And then just this morning I realized I left my headphones at the game. Now, I don't know if you guys have like valuable things, like maybe a cell phone or something, right? Like, if you ever leave something like electronics, like, and you lose them, what's your first normal reaction? You would like freak out. You're like, oh snap, my headphone's gone, blah blah blah. But I was like, okay, I lost my headphones. I just gotta let it go, right? And I think it's like, notice it's kind of weird, but it was a lot more easier because myself maybe a couple of years ago, I would have been so angry. It would have driven me crazy for the entire day. Like, how could you be so stupid? How did you lose your headphone? How did you forget, etc., etc. But because I've like kind of getting to this level where I'm understanding that like, A, don't be attached to things. It's not that serious. It's just a material thing. There was a lot less suffering that went on. Like, yeah, I lost my headphone. Oh well, that's it. You know, I don't know. I don't know if it resonates with you, but if you ever do lose something in the future, understand that like things are temporary, right? Things can get replaced. Yeah. So that's that. And so I don't have an actual like concentrated topic today, but I do have a couple of interesting stories that I'm reading. They're called like Buddhist parables, and then and this is actually like the number one, well not the number one, but one way in which like they teach like Buddhism, right? And so here's one of the parables, or one of like the really like short, like they're just like mini short stories that tell you interesting things. Here's one that's really interesting. Imagine you have a dirty shirt, right? What do you have to do? Well, you wash your dirty shirt with soap. However, if you don't rinse, and then obviously the soap cleans the shirt, right? But if you don't rinse the shirt of the soap as well, would it still stay clean? It's an interesting question, right? And that's actually that's the Buddhist parable right there. What does that even relate to? You have a dirty shirt, you clean it with soap, but at the end, you actually have to rinse the shirt of the soap as well for it to be truly clean. What's that supposed to relate to? Well, it goes back to the entire question of like trying to get to nirvana, trying to get to like desiring to get to nirvana, right? It's the same idea. And it's the same idea from last week, which is like, what's the difference between somebody, in terms of Buddhism, if we had to put it at a level of 0 to 100, what's the difference between the person who's at 99 and the difference with the person who's at 100? The soap represents Buddhism, right? The premise is this, right? That dirty shirt is this idea of life and how life is suffering. The soap represents Buddhism, and if you study it, you get to walk towards the path of well-being, which means you're cleaning this shirt. But by the very end, right, if you walk down this path and you have a clean shirt, you also, the parable, the conclusion is this: when you get to the highest level, you also have to let go of the Buddhist, the teachings of the Buddha as well. And so and it's like a very difficult, I feel like it's a very advanced idea, but it's the idea that once you study as much as you can, you walk down this path, you have a clean shirt, you have a like moral life, and then at the end, you learn to let it go. And once you let it go, that's when you achieve like enlightenment, okay? So that's a random way of answering the question of like, isn't desiring enlightenment still a desire? Yeah. That's the roundabout way, okay? So that's the first story. Here's the second story, and then, I actually really like the second story. Here's a story of a Zen master, right? He practices meditation for many years, like with extreme diligence. And one of the examples is that instead of like sleeping on his back, he'll sleep by sitting in the meditation pose, right? So he'll cross his leg, he'll sit up, etc., right? And he's been practicing for many years, but he hasn't found enlightenment yet. So that's kind of fascinating. How can you work so hard and so diligently and not yet do so? Okay. And then one day, some like novice monk also joins the temple, right? But to learn the ways of Buddhism. But this monk is actually extremely lazy, right? And so when they ring the bell to get the monks to do their morning duties, this novice monk is like, I'm just gonna lie in bed, whatever. I'm kind of being lazy right now. And so this Zen master says, novice monk, what are you doing? How can you be so lazy? Because if you stay lazy and you stay in your bed, lying like that, you're gonna probably be reborn as a snake who like lies underground. And so the novice monk replies to the Zen master, right? He says, okay, if I'm lying on my bed and I'm going to be reborn as a snake, you will probably be reborn as a toad, because you're always sitting in, meditation position all the time, right? And then upon hearing that, the Zen master became enlightened. And it's like, what? How did that, what was the point of that story? Like, what's that supposed to even mean? It's a very interesting story, right? But there's a like side story that connects to that story, okay? Here's the side story that connects to that story. Another master decided one day to pick up a brick, right? And then he started polishing this brick, okay? And then a student came up to him and said, why are you trying to polish this brick? And he says, I'm trying to make it into a mirror. And if you think about it, like, no matter how, and if you guys know like basic material science or whatever, like no matter how much you polish a brick, right, it will never turn into a mirror. Okay. What's that supposed to say? And I guess this is a good connection for you guys now. And how does it connect to the first story? No amount of sitting cross-legged or being in meditation position is going to make you a Buddha. Okay? It's not going to lead you to enlightenment. No amount of polishing this brick will ever make it a mirror. So how does it apply to you guys? And here's what I think about it, right? No amount of those people, and I'm not gonna like frame it in a negative way, but the people who show up to temple like once every holiday, and they just show up, they bow, and then they leave. They could do that for 100 years, but they'll never become enlightened, or they'll never become Buddha, right? What does it take? It's not about external cultivation. It's not about like the semblance of like just sitting there cross-legged. It's not about bowing to the Buddha that makes you become enlightened, right? It's about internal cultivation, and really that's the real story here. And I think the best way for you to like internally cultivate and like your level of wisdom is just by sitting here listening to the stories and like coming up with more questions to push yourself to understand Buddhism, right? It does get redundant, but if you can, to some extent, articulate the true ideas behind it, then you are more ahead of your peers in every single respect, right? More so than like even like the elders before you who only know to show up every once in a blue moon, right? Because I feel like the people who sit here and listen to like the monks lecture, like, and they consistently do so, like notice how, well, and if you like listen to the monk's lecture, like he's trying to build up like thought processes and build up the way you think about the world and the way, and like the nature of reality, right? And so every single opportunity that you get to listen to all these things, you get better and better. And if, to some extent, I think like it's way more important to really cultivate the inner than the outside, okay? And so that's pretty much the gist of what I had for today. Yeah, that's pretty much the gist of all I had for today. So, if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. But if you don't have any questions, think about questions, okay? Yeah, sometimes I say things that like may spark up curiosity, but if not, it's fine. And keep in mind, like the tradition of Buddhism, like the Buddha himself says, do not accept my words to be absolute truth. You need to question everything I say until you yourself believe it to be true. And then only then do you accept the words as true. So whatever I say, you can just disregard it, right? Analyze it for yourself, and when you finally say, oh, is this true or is it not true? Or, yeah, then you could just agree with it or not. Yeah. Okay, that's pretty much it. So if you guys have any questions, if not, thank you for listening. Short. Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to be back until March actually, because my parents had to go on vacation, so they're not driving me. So, yeah. So next lecture will be March, first 2 weekends of March. But yeah, also I mean it teaches you, well, not a, you know, to some extent, listening to these lectures in English, I wish I had gotten to listen to them when I was a kid, but yeah, now you have more time to reflect, and then hopefully you guys will come back even more rejuvenated with more questions. But yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Wait a minute. Let's just stop right here. I'm cooking.